The only way that the human male survives, reproduces, and goes on to live any semblance of a life is by convincing himself and others of this system, and by giving women no other choice other than to participate in this system by hoarding resources away from women. Because it would be nice, wouldn't it, if women could just reject it and say like, no thank you, I don't want to do this anymore. This isn't fun and I don't like it and I want you to stop. The women have been saying this for a very long time, but it doesn't matter to men because men know inherently, like an animal knows, what it needs to do in order to survive on a big scale. So in a lot of animal communities where the male species acts like the human male species, right, where the male species are violent and grapey and overall unhelpful, and like when there gets to be too many of them, it just becomes problematic, and like the female species are put in danger because of it. That doesn't exist in nature. That doesn't exist. Problematic males don't exist in nature. They are eliminated. A lot of animals have structures where there's only one or two males. It's really just one. Because where there's more than one male, it's going to be a power struggle that's going to affect everybody else negatively. So what nature does in a lot of cases is it eliminates all the males down to just one. Unless the males can figure out a way to trick or to subjugate the natural way of life. That's what human males have been doing for centuries. Some of our earliest written laws and rules exist to control women, exist to control women's movement about the world. And that is for a reason. Those same rules also take away property and ownership rights from women and give those rights exclusively to men. Because men needed to be able to handicap women in some way, shape, or form so that we would need men to survive. So they've basically taken the way of nature and flipped it on its head, which is very unnatural, which is why women have been rejecting it for centuries to no avail. Because what men have been able to do is to hoard resources and to use force against women and to use abuse and subjugation against women in order to control them and in order to ensure their own survival of the male population. We also know that men used to not reproduce nearly as much as women. For example, back even in the hunter-gatherer days, 17 women reproduced for every one man. And I just feel like once we started gaining consciousness and things like that, the thing that helped Homo sapiens survive was belief. The ability to believe in things that aren't real, things that don't exist. And this is just one outpouring of that. Like, that's the reason why we have religion, but it's also the reason why we have the patriarchy, is because of this evolutionary development that happened in our brain that allowed us to unite in like these big, huge groups. Whereas like Neanderthal groups were typically comprised of like 4 or 5 people. Homo sapiens were able to mobilize giant crowds just by using raw tactics and by using like their belief in certain things to mobilize masses and to sort of like change and manipulate and alter reality. And unsurprisingly, this actually resulted in Homo sapiens eliminating other groups of sapiens that were roaming the earth simply because they had this ability to share belief systems. So if you were able to understand all that, then this should make perfect sense to you. Men convinced women that women need men. The inception of this was to convince everybody that God is not a woman, God is a man, and that men are somehow more valuable in society than women, and that men are somehow more valuable even to nature than women are, which is demonstrably not true. Demonstrably not true. There are like basically no species in which there's like more males than there is females on purpose. There just isn't. And it is women that are able to carry and give birth to other humans. Having that many men around is not that important unless all of those men needed a reason to survive and to not be killed off. Even then, this was always the work of like much richer men, because if they could convince the poor and unimportant men that they were still like really important to society, they could also convince these men to go into battle and lay their lives down for a cause, basically to further the spread of their own seed, but they're actually dying. But men are just easily convinced. They're easily convinced that they're important because they don't feel important, because they know that they're not that important to Mother Nature. Women are far, far, far more important. That's why women historically have not been conscripted to go to war, because women are the ones that will need to repopulate the earth after the war. And that's what's important to Mother Nature, to our actual survival. Men have actually created this artificial system that ensures their survival at the expense of women. The moral of the story is that men's survival rests completely on this. It's kind of interesting because the patriarchy was invented around the time that women also invented agriculture, and men became obsessed with the idea of land ownership and child ownership, like people ownership. So this was the time that slavery got introduced. This was the time that men decided that children should have their last name in order to survive. If you look back at the actual history of hunting and gathering, it was mostly the women that did both. both. So men know inherently that they don't possess the necessary skills to survive. They were not able to hunt, forage, gather, all of those things effectively without women. It was women that knew what berries not to eat. It was women that figured out new, better, creative ways to hunt that didn't involve just like tracking an animal for hours and then trying to stab it. Like all of these things, if you look into the research, women have always helped men to survive. So men have always inherently, intrinsically known that if I don't have a woman by my side, I'm probably not going to survive very well. This is why the subjugation of women was so completely necessary. It's not for kicks and giggles. Like it's not just for fun. It's really their survival depends on women. The survival of the male species, and just by default, depends on the female part of that species, of course, but especially in the case of human males, they have over the history of time have never quite proven themselves to be particularly useful or prone to survival. It's always been women that prove themselves useful and prone to survival. Men actually just went out and created an artificial usefulness for themselves. They hoarded resources, they limited women's mobility, they told women lies about themselves, they subjugated women, they raped women, they assaulted women, all for the purpose of making themselves useful to the same women that they were abusing and hoarding resources from. Because everybody needs resources to survive, even women, right? When you are cut off from resources, when you're cut off from community and you are forced to deal with men in the capacities that women have been forced to deal with men in, you become subjugated and you become easy to control and easy to abuse. And women are just now waking up to this fact. So we are still like early on in our history. And this is really some of women's first attempts to sort of, you know, shake men off and try to survive on their own. And you can see how the men are feeling about that. So be careful out there. I love you so much. It's the only way for men to survive. That's all there is to it. The only way that the human